It happened during the autumn of 2025 on what should have been one of the most ordinary business trips of my career. I've spent years traveling for work, driving thousands of miles through small towns and forgotten highways. I've stayed in every type of hotel imaginable, from luxury resorts to roadside motels where the walls were so thin you could hear people breathing in the next room. Strange noises, restless nights, unfamiliar hallways. None of that had ever bothered me. Until that night. Even now, months later, I still replay every detail in my mind, searching for a logical explanation. I've examined every memory from every possible angle, convincing myself dozens of times that fatigue must have distorted my perception. And yet, one detail always remains. There are simply too many coincidences. That morning, I had been driving across the northwestern part of Missouri, stopping from town to town, meeting more than 60 potential clients. By the time evening arrived, my body felt as though it had been poured full of wet concrete. Every muscle ached. My eyes burned from staring at highways and spreadsheets all day. When I finally checked into the hotel, I was relieved to discover it wasn't one of those cold corporate chains. The building had been designed with heavy timber beams, stone fireplaces, and handcrafted wooden furniture that gave it the appearance of an old mountain lodge. Soft yellow lighting filled the corridors, making the place feel surprisingly warm. At first, looking back, I think what unsettled me most wasn't what the hotel looked like. It was what I didn't see. From the moment I arrived until sunrise the next morning, I never passed another guest on my floor. Not one. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was unnatural. My room was 312, located on the third and highest floor. Once I settled in, I ordered takeout, opened my laptop, and began catching up on work. I still had dozens of follow-up emails to schedule before morning, so I buried myself in spreadsheets and customer reports. Around 11:30 p.m., the silence broke. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. A door slammed. Several hurried voices spoke over one another. It sounded urgent, but not chaotic enough for me to investigate. Hotels are full of late arrivals, loud families and guests coming back from bars. I barely looked up from my computer. 15 minutes later, I realized I'd forgotten to buy bottled water, so I grabbed my room key and stepped into the hallway. 3 doors down, a hotel room stood open. Halfway inside the doorway sat a stretcher. 2 EMTs were positioned beside it. An older man, probably in his 60s, lay motionless on top. I couldn't see his face clearly. Only one pale arm rested limply beside him, while part of his torso disappeared beneath several blankets. No one appeared panicked. It looked like a routine medical emergency. Perhaps he had fainted. Perhaps he had suffered a heart attack. Perhaps he had simply fallen. Not wanting to intrude on someone's worst night, I quietly turned around and went back into my room. 10 minutes later, I tried again. This time, everything had changed. The stretcher had been rolled completely into the hallway. One EMT was driving both hands into the man's chest with violent, relentless compressions. Another stared intensely at a portable cardiac monitor. Then I heard it. That single, continuous electronic tone. Flatline. A sound every person recognizes instantly. There is something horrifying about realizing you are standing only a few feet away from the exact moment another human being slips beyond the point where medicine can reach them. One of the EMTs looked directly at me. "Sir, back inside your room." His voice wasn't angry. It was firm. Professional. I obeyed immediately. When I closed the door behind me, the digital clock beside my bed read 12:18 a.m. For a while, I tried returning to work. It helped distract me from what I'd witnessed. Eventually, exhaustion won. I shut my laptop, brushed my teeth, turned off every light except the bathroom nightlight, and climbed into bed. The room was completely silent. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 soft taps against the door. They were so gentle I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard anything at all. Old buildings make strange noises. Pipes expand. Wood contracts. Air conditioners click. I ignored it. Less than a minute later, knock, knock, knock. Exactly the same rhythm, this time louder, deliberate. Someone was definitely outside. I got out of bed and walked to the peephole. Nothing. The hallway stretched empty in both directions. No movement, no shadows, no footsteps fading away. Just silence. I remember actually laughing under my breath. I thought some kids must be playing games. As I stepped away from the door, the handle slowly rotated downward, not violently, not someone trying to break in. It moved with incredible patience, almost, as though whoever stood outside simply wanted to know whether it was locked. I froze. Every instinct told me not to move, not to breathe, not to make a sound. For reasons I still cannot explain, I suddenly couldn't force myself to look through the peephole again. Instead, my eyes drifted toward the narrow strip of light beneath the door. The light disappeared. Something was standing there, perfectly still. No footsteps, no shifting weight, just complete darkness blocking every inch beneath the door. 5 seconds. 10. Maybe longer. Time felt distorted. Then the light slowly returned. A moment later came a sound so subtle it almost seemed imagined. Scratch. Not sharp. Not aggressive. It sounded like fingertips, or perhaps the sleeve of someone's jacket, slowly dragging across the outside surface of my door, from one side to the other. Then nothing. Absolute silence. I've carried a legally owned firearm for years while traveling. I've dealt with aggressive strangers. I've broken up fights. I've driven through tornadoes. None of those experiences prepared me for the fear I felt in that moment. This wasn't ordinary fear. It wasn't even panic. It was something deeper, something primitive, a sensation that every instinct inside me was screaming the same impossible warning. Do not open that door. I turned on every lamp in the room. The darkness suddenly felt unbearable. For nearly an hour, I sat upright against the headboard with random YouTube videos playing in the background, not because I cared what I was watching, but because I couldn't tolerate the silence anymore. Eventually, another sound echoed through the hallway. A door opened. It came from the very room where the paramedics had worked. Someone stepped outside. Then I heard quiet murmuring, not talking on a phone, not speaking loudly, more like someone whispering to themselves. Relief washed over me. Another guest was awake. Finally gathering enough courage, I opened my own door. A man stood outside that room. He wasn't wearing a hotel uniform. He wasn't law enforcement. He wasn't an EMT. He looked like an ordinary businessman in his mid-40s, dressed in dark slacks and a neatly pressed white button-down shirt. Everything about him seemed completely normal, except his eyes. They were deeply sunken, not tired, not bloodshot. They looked hollow, as though sleep had abandoned him years ago, or as though he had seen something no human mind was meant to witness. Trying to sound casual, I asked, "Were you with the gentleman the ambulance took earlier?" He slowly turned toward me. For several long seconds, he simply stared. No expression, no blinking. Then he nodded once. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost emotionless. There were 3 knocks. Silence. The third time, he tilted his head ever so slightly, was when they answered. My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" For the first time, the corner of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile. Not friendly, not threatening, just knowing. They don't always leave immediately. Then he turned away, without another word. Without looking back, he walked toward the stairwell. His footsteps faded. And then, nothing. I never heard the stairwell door open. The following morning, after barely sleeping, I went downstairs around 8:30, hoping fresh coffee would clear my head. Instead, the conversation at the front desk only deepened the nightmare. I casually asked the receptionist about the medical emergency on my floor. She frowned. "What medical emergency?" I described the paramedics, the CPR, the stretcher, the room. She listened politely before shaking her head. According to the hotel records, the room I described had been vacant. Its last registered guest had checked out the previous afternoon. No one had checked in afterward. She also mentioned occupancy had been unusually low for weeks. Only a handful of guests were staying on the 3rd floor. All of them. At the opposite end of the hallway, then she asked a question I'll never forget. Just to be sure. She glanced toward her computer. Was the room exactly 3 doors down from room 312? Everything inside me went cold. 3 doors. Room 312. 3 knocks. The strange man's words. The 3rd time was when they answered. I stood there, unable to speak. Since that day, I've tried to dismantle the entire experience piece by piece. Perhaps the receptionist simply hadn't been informed about an overnight emergency. Perhaps hotel management chose not to discuss a guest's death. Perhaps I miscounted the rooms. Perhaps another traveler decided to play the cruelest prank imaginable. Perhaps exhaustion, stress, sleep deprivation, and grief from witnessing CPR combined into an unusually vivid hallucination. Each explanation accounts for part of the story. None explain all of it. Most unsettling of all is the strange consistency surrounding the number 3. It appears in every major moment of that night, almost like a pattern deliberately waiting to be noticed. For nearly 3 weeks afterward, I wasn't myself. Friends noticed I seemed distracted. Coworkers asked if everything was okay. I blamed deadlines, travel, lack of sleep, anything except the truth. Because how do you tell people you may have witnessed something that refuses to fit inside reality? Even now, whenever I check into a hotel room alone, I automatically glance down the hallway. I count the doors. And if I ever hear 3 slow knocks after midnight, I don't answer. I never will. Ever since that business trip in the fall of 2025, I've continued traveling almost every week for work. Thankfully, nothing remotely similar has ever happened again. At least, not to me. The morning after everything that happened in that hotel, I packed my belongings faster than I ever had before. I barely glanced around the room one last time before zipping my suitcase shut. Every instinct told me to leave as quickly as possible. Checking out felt strangely ordinary. The lobby smelled of fresh coffee. Soft country music played quietly through the speakers. Housekeepers chatted with one another as they pushed carts through the hallways. Several guests were eating breakfast, laughing, discussing travel plans, completely unaware that only hours earlier I had been convinced something impossible had stood outside my door. For a brief moment, I almost believed none of it had happened. Maybe exhaustion had finally caught up with me. Maybe stress had distorted my memory. Maybe every terrifying detail had been nothing more than an elaborate nightmare. Yet one habit has remained with me ever since. Every time I check into a hotel now, I unconsciously count. I count how many doors separate my room from the elevator. I count the distance to the stairwell. I notice room numbers, exit signs, hallway intersections. Most importantly, I notice the number 3. It's irrational. I know it is. But fear has a remarkable way of rewriting logic. That night, the knocking always came in groups of 3. It happened twice, never a third time. Oddly enough, that's the only detail that still gives me comfort. Because if I ever hear another sequence of 3 slow knocks outside a hotel room after midnight, I won't wait to discover who or what is asking to be invited inside. I'll leave. Immediately. No questions. No curiosity. Some mysteries are better left unanswered. But that wasn't the only unsettling experience I've encountered. The next story happened only hours before I'm writing this. Unlike the previous one, this wasn't confined to strange sounds in an empty hallway. This involved another person, someone very real, or at least, someone who began behaving in ways that no longer felt entirely human. Most of what happened centered around my roommate, whom I'll call Misty. Everyone else's names have been changed for privacy, except mine. Misty had recently broken up with her boyfriend, who I'll call Paul. Before everything fell apart, I'd met him several times. Honestly, he seemed like a decent guy. Quiet. Friendly. The type of person who could sit for hours talking about old video games, horror movies, or whatever random topic came up. Whenever we hung out, he'd roll blunts for both of us because neither Misty nor I ever learned how. He laughed easily, never raised his voice, never gave me any reason to believe there was anything dangerous beneath the surface. Looking back now, that may be the most disturbing part. People often imagine dangerous individuals as obviously unstable, angry eyes, unpredictable tempers, constant aggression. Reality rarely looks like that. Sometimes the most frightening people appear perfectly ordinary, right up until the moment they aren't. A couple of weeks ago, Misty ended the relationship. She never told me every detail, only that it ended badly enough for her to seek a restraining order against him. That alone was enough to make me uneasy. You don't go through the legal process of obtaining a restraining order unless something has gone seriously wrong. Still, life moved on. Or so we thought. 2 nights ago, I was sitting in my room replaying SWAT 4 on my laptop. The apartment was quiet, the kind of comfortable silence that settles over a building after midnight. Then came a knock. Nothing dramatic. No pounding. No frantic banging. Just one completely ordinary knock against my bedroom door. "Come in," I said, without taking my eyes off the screen. The door slowly creaked open. Misty stood there. Something immediately felt wrong. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't even breathing heavily. Instead, she looked disconnected, almost as though she'd been sleepwalking. Her face had gone completely pale. Her eyes looked unfocused. When she spoke, her voice came out barely above a whisper, slurred, flat, almost emotionless. Paul broke my window. A pause, and threw my clothes inside. Then she looked directly at me. "Can you help me?" For a second, I honestly couldn't process what she'd said. I paused my game and walked closer. The closer I got, the more obvious it became that she wasn't intoxicated. She wasn't exhausted. She was in shock. The kind of shock where the brain simply refuses to accept what's happened. Slowly, she explained everything. Paul had come to the apartment. Instead of knocking, instead of calling, instead of yelling, he smashed the bedroom window. Then he threw a garbage bag filled with clothes she'd accidentally left at his house through the broken glass. On the surface, it almost sounded childish, an angry ex throwing belongings back. But one detail made my stomach sink. Misty sleeps in a loft-style bunk bed. Instead of another mattress underneath, there's a desk where she studies. The bed itself sits directly beside the window. Paul had been there before. He knew exactly where her head rested while she slept. The shattered glass hadn't landed randomly. It landed precisely where she spends every night. Whether he'd intended to hurt her or merely frighten her, I couldn't say. But either possibility was terrifying. I'm a fairly big guy. I've trained enough to defend myself if necessary. Paul, while athletic, is much smaller than I am. Oddly, I wasn't afraid for myself. I was afraid for her. I told her everything would be okay. Even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. We called the police immediately. After hanging up, I stepped outside onto the front porch. The neighborhood looked deserted. Streetlights cast long shadows across rows of parked cars. Nothing moved. No engines, no footsteps, no voices. And yet, I couldn't shake the unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me from somewhere beyond the darkness. It's difficult to describe that feeling to someone who's never experienced it. You don't necessarily see anyone. You don't hear breathing. You don't notice movement. You simply know. Every instinct begins whispering the same warning. You're not alone. I told Misty to lock every door and remain inside while I searched the parking lot. Nothing. 45 minutes passed. Still no police. When I finally called dispatch again, they apologized and explained we were second in line. It had been an unusually busy night. As frustrating as it was, I understood. While we waited, Misty's phone kept lighting up. Text after text from Paul. Some were insults. Some were threats. One simply read, "Wrong move, bitch." Another said, "I want my vape back." The strange thing was, she didn't have it. We searched the apartment. Nothing. Neither of us could remember seeing it, which made the message feel less like a demand and more like an excuse, almost as though he wanted a reason to keep contacting her, or perhaps a reason to come back. 3 more agonizing hours crawled by before a patrol car finally arrived. By then, it was nearly 3 in the morning. The officer was professional, patient, and sympathetic. He documented the broken window, photographed the damage, reviewed the threatening text messages, and confirmed that because of the existing restraining order, officers already had Paul's address on file. If he comes back, the officer told us, don't confront him. Call us immediately. Simple advice. Reasonable advice. The kind of thing anyone would say, but something about the way he emphasized comes back made me uneasy, almost as though he believed it wasn't a matter of if, only when. The next day I left for work as usual. I worked the closing shift, meaning I wouldn't return home until late. Before leaving, I stood at the front door longer than usual. I looked at the repaired window, checked every lock twice. For reasons I couldn't explain, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. Not fear. Not exactly. More like certainty. A quiet voice in the back of my mind kept repeating the same thought. He's going to come back while I'm gone. I tried to ignore it. All day I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe the police visit had scared him away. Maybe he'd finally realized how serious the restraining order was. Maybe it was over. Then at exactly 10:48 p.m., while I was still at work, my phone vibrated. One message from Misty. The moment I saw her name on the screen, my stomach dropped. Before I even unlocked the phone, somehow, I already knew he had come back. The next part of the nightmare unfolded while I was still at work. To this day, I think that's what disturbed me the most. I wasn't there. I couldn't protect her. I couldn't even see what was happening. All I could do was watch the situation unravel through a series of text messages that grew more terrifying with every notification. Looking back, the timeline seems almost unreal. Everything happened within less than an hour, yet every minute felt like it stretched into an eternity. Around 10:30 that evening, Misty stepped outside her bedroom to take a small bag of trash to the dumpster behind the apartment building. It was something she'd done hundreds of times before. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. The hallway was quiet and the parking lot outside was nearly empty. The air was still the kind of silence that usually signals the end of an ordinary day. As she walked back toward her room, she casually glanced over her shoulder. That's when she saw it. A dark figure slipping through her bedroom doorway. Not running, not sneaking. Simply walking inside as though it belonged there. The figure disappeared before she could react. For a split second, her heart stopped. Her first thought was Paul. His build, his height, his dark clothing. It all matched. But then logic pushed back against fear. Misty has always been the first to joke about her own imagination. She'll openly admit she sometimes startles herself over shadows or reflections. She's the kind of person who can convince herself a coat hanging on a chair is someone standing in the room, so she forced herself to laugh it off. Maybe she'd only caught a glimpse of a shadow. Maybe it was the hallway light reflecting through the window. Maybe stress from everything that had happened the night before was finally getting to her. Still, she couldn't ignore the feeling completely. Something deep inside her refused to let it go. She searched every room in the apartment. The bathroom, the kitchen, the living room, behind the shower curtain, even under the beds. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No broken locks. No open windows. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Eventually, she convinced herself she'd imagined it. She sat on her bed, unlocked her phone, and mindlessly scrolled through social media trying to settle her racing thoughts. 10 minutes later, she stood up. She needed cleaning supplies to deal with the broken glass still scattered around her bedroom from the smashed window the night before. The supplies were kept inside her bedroom closet. She walked over, reached for the handle, pulled the door open, and froze. Standing inside the closet, only a few feet away, was Paul. He wasn't hiding behind boxes. He wasn't crouching. He wasn't moving. He was simply standing there in complete silence, staring directly at her. No surprise. No anger. No panic over being discovered. Just watching. His face was completely expressionless. Misty later told me the shock was so overwhelming that for a second her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. She said it felt less like finding someone inside her closet, and more like her closet had somehow opened into somewhere she was never meant to look. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to scream, to fight. Instead, she did something far more remarkable. She stayed calm. Years later, I still don't know how she managed it. In situations like that, most people either freeze completely or explode into panic. She did neither. Keeping her voice as steady as she possibly could, she quietly asked, "What are you doing here?" Paul didn't blink. He didn't step forward. His answer came in a voice so flat that she later described it as sounding almost mechanical. "I just want my vape back." That was it. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement that he'd broken a window the previous night, no concern that he had violated a restraining order. Just those 6 words. "I just want my vape back." It wasn't believable. It wasn't even logical. Neither of us had seen his vape. We'd searched the apartment after he'd demanded it through text messages the night before. It wasn't there. By then, it had become painfully obvious that the vape was never the point. It was an excuse. A reason to keep returning. A reason to keep inserting himself into her life. A reason to remind her that locked doors and court orders meant nothing to him. While continuing to speak to him as though everything was perfectly normal, Misty picked up her phone. Without making any sudden movements, without letting him realize she was asking for help, she began texting me. Each message was short, carefully worded, the kind of text someone writes while trying not to alert the person standing only a few feet away. When my phone buzzed at work, I looked down, expecting something completely ordinary. Instead, I saw words that instantly drained every ounce of warmth from my body. "Paul is here. He's in my room." For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. It didn't feel real. It felt like one of those messages people send as a joke. Then another text arrived. "He's standing in my closet." My hands started shaking. I immediately called her. No answer. Another text appeared. "Don't call. Just help." Those 2 words hit harder than anything I've ever read. Not because they were dramatic, but because they weren't. There was no panic. No excessive punctuation. No desperate pleading. Just quiet certainty. She needed help. Immediately, at almost the exact same moment, something happened that still feels almost unbelievable. My manager walked over and casually said, "It's dead tonight. If you want to head home early, go ahead." I didn't even answer. I grabbed my bag and practically ran out of the building. As soon as I reached the sidewalk, I dialed 911. Trying to keep my voice steady, I explained everything to the dispatcher. The broken window, the restraining order, the threatening text messages, the fact that the suspect was currently inside the apartment. The dispatcher interrupted only once. "Stay on the line." Those words were strangely comforting. For the first time that night, I knew someone else understood how serious the situation had become. The ride home felt endless. Every red light seemed cruel. Every delay felt unbearable. I kept imagining every possible outcome. What if he'd become violent? What if she'd tried to escape? What if I was already too late? Those thoughts replayed over and over until the bus finally reached my stop. When I arrived outside the apartment building, flashing blue and red lights reflected across the windows. Several patrol cars were already there. Officers stood near the entrance. Paul was sitting on the curb. His hands were cuffed behind his back. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. The tension left my body so suddenly my knees nearly gave out. Misty wasn't there anymore. Friends had taken her somewhere safe while officers processed the scene. Later that night, she told me everything. Every second. Every word. Every moment she had stood only a few feet away from the man who had illegally entered her home. What shocked me wasn't only what Paul had done. It was how unbelievably calm Misty had remained. The responding officer later spoke with me after taking my statement. Even he looked visibly unsettled. Experienced police officers see disturbing situations almost every day. Yet when he heard that Paul had been silently waiting inside her bedroom closet, his expression changed. His eyes widened. He paused before writing another note in his report. Finally, he looked at me and said quietly, "He's definitely going to jail." Hearing those words brought relief, but not peace, because jail couldn't erase what had already happened. Someone had invaded the one place every person believes should be untouchable. Home. The place where you sleep. The place where you let your guard down. Once that illusion is shattered, it never feels quite the same again. That experience permanently changed the way I thought about personal safety. Unfortunately, it wasn't the only unsettling story I've encountered. Another incident happened several years earlier during my first semester at university. At the time, I was 18 years old and experiencing freedom for the very first time. I'd recently moved away from home and into a small apartment on campus. It wasn't luxurious by any means. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person. The living room consisted of an old couch squeezed against one wall with a tiny coffee table in front of it. My single bed sat in the corner beneath a narrow window that overlooked a quiet parking lot. Still, I loved it. It was my own space. For the first time in my life, I could come and go whenever I wanted. I decorated the apartment with posters, books, and a few cheap plants until it finally felt like home. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that, within those walls, a conversation with a complete stranger would slowly evolve into one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. One quiet evening, roughly 2 months after moving in, I was sitting alone on the couch watching television when my phone vibrated on the coffee table. An Instagram notification. Someone had requested to follow me. The username meant nothing to me. Still, that wasn't unusual. My profile was public, and every so often random people would send requests or start conversations. I ignored it. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed again. The same account had sent me a direct message. It was nothing more than a simple greeting. Normally, I try not to ignore people without a reason, so I replied with a polite hello. At first, the conversation was completely ordinary. He asked how my evening was going, whether university was treating me well, what I was studying, the kind of harmless small talk people exchange every day online. Gradually, though, the tone shifted, almost so slowly that I didn't notice it happening. He asked whether I was single, then what my ideal boyfriend looked like, then whether I lived alone, then what I was wearing. I remember letting out an irritated sigh. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time I'd received messages like that. I'm openly gay, and my Instagram bio made that clear. Every so often, I'd receive inappropriate or overly personal messages from strangers who quickly crossed boundaries. At first, I assumed this was just another one of those conversations. I had no idea. It was about to become something far more disturbing. At first, I tried to convince myself there was nothing truly alarming about the conversation. Uncomfortable? Absolutely. Threatening? Not yet. Anyone who has spent enough time on social media has probably encountered strangers who ignore boundaries, ask invasive questions, or mistake anonymity for permission. I had dealt with people like that before, so although this conversation was beginning to make my skin crawl, I still believed I was simply dealing with another socially awkward stranger. Then everything shifted. Without any warning, he sent me a photograph of himself. A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Do you think I'm attractive?" Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the picture. The man looked to be somewhere between his late 20s and early 30s. He had a broad, muscular build, pale skin that almost looked washed out beneath, harsh indoor lighting, messy brown hair that appeared as though it hadn't been brushed all day, piercing blue eyes and uneven facial hair scattered across his chin and upper lip. Objectively, there wasn't anything horrifying about his appearance. If I'd passed him in a grocery store, I probably wouldn't have looked twice. But photographs capture more than faces. Sometimes they capture something far more difficult to explain. His expression unsettled me immediately. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't attempting to look attractive. He wasn't making the exaggerated facial expressions people normally make for profile pictures. Instead, he simply stared directly into the camera, completely expressionless. His eyes didn't seem focused on the lens. They felt focused on whoever would eventually be looking back. I can't explain why that bothered me so much. It just did. Without replying, I closed the conversation. I figured the interaction would quietly end there. I was wrong. Almost immediately, my phone vibrated again. Another message, then another, then another. Every notification carried the exact same request. Let's play Truth or Dare. I politely declined. He ignored my answer. A minute later, he asked again. I declined a second time. Again, he acted as though I hadn't responded. His persistence was becoming unnerving. There was no humor in it, no friendliness, just quiet determination, as though the game itself mattered far more than the conversation. Around that time, my best friend Connor stopped by my apartment. We'd known each other for years, and like most 18-year-olds, we found humor in situations that probably deserved a little more caution. I handed him my phone. Check this guy out. Connor read through the messages before laughing. What a weirdo. He looked at me with the kind of grin only an 18-year-old can have. You should just play. Looking back now, I wish we'd never entertained the idea. But hindsight has a way of making obvious what curiosity hides. At the time, we thought we were in control. Worst case scenario, we'd laugh for 5 minutes and then block him. No harm done. So against my better judgment, I agreed. I honestly can't even remember what my first question was. Something completely forgettable. Probably one of those meaningless questions people ask when they don't care about the answer. He replied almost immediately. Then it became his turn. Truth or dare? Truth, I answered. Connor leaned over my shoulder while the little typing indicator appeared on the screen. The two of us started making jokes. He'll probably ask if you're single. No, he's definitely going to ask something sexual. We laughed. Neither of us had the slightest idea that the mood was about to change. The typing stopped. His message appeared. It wasn't a truth question. It wasn't even remotely related to the game. Instead, he wrote, "So how are you finding life at university?" Silence. The room seemed to empty of every sound. Connor looked at me. I looked at Connor. Then we both slowly looked back down at my phone. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Not because the question itself was strange, but because it shouldn't have been possible. I had never told him I was attending university. Not once. I had never mentioned living on campus. I had never spoken about moving away from home. As far as this stranger should have known, I was just another random person on Instagram. Yet somehow, he already knew. The atmosphere in my apartment changed instantly. Just moments earlier, we'd been laughing. Now, neither of us felt like joking anymore. Something no longer fit. I grew up in a tiny country town several hours away, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else. If I'd met this man before leaving home, I would have remembered him. I was absolutely certain I'd never seen him before. Connor immediately started asking questions. Did you tell him? No. Does your profile mention university? No. Did you post anything? Again. No, my Instagram was almost empty. I rarely uploaded photos. My most recent post had simply been a few pictures of my hometown before moving away. Nothing about campus. Nothing about classes. Nothing about my apartment. Nothing. Even stranger, the university itself wasn't particularly large. Students constantly crossed paths. After only a few months, I'd become familiar with dozens of faces. If this man had attended the same campus, I felt confident I would have recognized him. But I didn't. Not even vaguely. Every explanation we came up with collapsed almost immediately. Maybe he knew someone from my hometown. Maybe we had mutual friends. Maybe he'd guessed. Maybe. Every theory required information he simply shouldn't have had. Finally, with no better solution, I blocked the account. The conversation ended. At least, that's what I believed. For weeks afterward, the incident lingered in the back of my mind. Every now and then, Connor would randomly bring it up. What do you think that guy actually knew? We'd spend another 20 minutes inventing theories. Online stalker. Someone from my hometown using a fake profile. A mutual acquaintance. An elaborate prank. None of the explanations felt satisfying. Eventually, real life pushed the mystery aside. University assignments piled up. Exams arrived. New friendships formed. Time moved forward the way it always does. Gradually, the memory faded. Months turned into years. Until one day I realized I hadn't thought about that strange conversation in a very long time. I assumed that chapter of my life had quietly ended. I couldn't have been more wrong. 2 years passed. I was 21 by then. I'd graduated from living on campus and had rented a house with Connor and 2 other friends. Life felt stable, comfortable. The strange Instagram conversation had become nothing more than an odd story we occasionally told at parties. Then, one quiet evening, I was sitting alone in my bedroom when my phone vibrated. An Instagram notification. Someone new had followed me. I glanced at the username. It meant nothing to me. Probably another viewer who had found one of my TikTok videos. I barely gave it a second thought. A moment later, another notification appeared. Message request. Without hesitation, I opened it. Once again, it was only a simple greeting. Ordinary. Polite. Almost painfully normal. But this time, an uneasy feeling settled into my chest before I even typed a reply, because somewhere deep inside a memory I hadn't visited in 2 years suddenly resurfaced. The wording. The timing. The silence that always came before the questions. I couldn't explain why. I couldn't prove anything. Yet every instinct whispered the same warning. I'd seen this pattern before, and I had the overwhelming feeling that whoever was behind the screen had never actually stopped watching. The moment I hit send, the reply came back almost instantly. Not a sentence. Not a greeting. A photograph. I tapped on it without thinking. The instant the image filled my screen, every muscle in my body locked up. It was him. There wasn't the slightest room for doubt. The same unnaturally pale complexion. The same unkempt brown hair. The same piercing blue eyes that somehow looked cold even through a phone screen. And most unsettling of all, the same blank expression. 2 years had passed since that bizarre conversation during my first semester at university, yet he looked almost exactly the same. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't trying to appear friendly. He simply stared into the camera with an intensity that made it feel less like a selfie, and more like he was staring directly at me. A chill spread across my shoulders. Almost instinctively, I whispered, "No way." I didn't reply. I couldn't. Instead, I muted the conversation, set my phone face down on my desk, and tried convincing myself it wasn't worth thinking about until Connor came home. I wanted him to see the photo. I wanted to make sure I wasn't somehow exaggerating the memory. Surely he'd remember the strange man from university. Surely there had to be some explanation. What I failed to remember, something that would haunt me later, was why I'd blocked this man in the first place. Memory has a strange habit of sanding away the sharp edges of fear. Over 2 years, the unsettling details had faded. I remembered the odd conversation. I remembered the impossible question about university. But I'd forgotten how obsessive he had become before I finally cut off contact. If I had remembered, I would have blocked him that very second. Instead, life intervened. Later that evening, an unrelated family emergency demanded my full attention. The muted conversation disappeared beneath a flood of phone calls, messages, and responsibilities. Hours turned into days. Completely unintentionally, I forgot about him, at least until several days later. One afternoon, while absent-mindedly scrolling through Instagram, I noticed his conversation sitting near the very top of my inbox. Dozens of unread messages. I frowned. Curiosity won. I opened the chat. My stomach immediately dropped. The message counter seemed endless. He hadn't stopped after I ignored him. He'd continued talking, hour after hour, day after day. The messages stretched down the screen farther than I could initially see. Some were strangely polite. Others were disturbingly intimate. Then, without warning, the tone would shift. One message begged for conversation. The next accused me of ignoring him. Then came insults. Then apologies. Then another attempt at ordinary small talk, as though none of the previous messages had ever been sent. Reading them felt like watching someone argue with themselves. His personality seemed to change every few minutes. Friendly, hostile, lonely, manipulative, desperate, calm, then furious all over again. There was no pattern, no consistency, only chaos. Buried between the text messages were photographs. Explicit photographs. Images I never asked for. Images I immediately closed. At that point, the situation no longer felt merely uncomfortable. It felt obsessive, calculated, as though my silence wasn't discouraging him. It was encouraging him to try even harder. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to Connor, who happened to be working that afternoon. His first response confused me. Who is this? For a second, I wondered whether I'd imagined the entire university incident. Then I reminded him. The weird truth or dare guy. There was a long pause. Then another message appeared. Oh, I remember. Even through text, I could almost hear the realization in his voice. His advice was immediate. Block him. Simple. Direct. Exactly what I should have done the moment I recognized him. As my thumb hovered over the block button, another thought slipped into my mind. one that disturbed me far more than the messages themselves. How had he found me? 2 entire years had passed. We shared no mutual friends. No family members followed him. There was no visible connection linking us together. My profile picture had changed. My content had changed. Almost everything about my online presence had changed. Yet somehow, he found me anyway. Had he remembered me all those years? Had he periodically searched my name until I finally appeared again? Or had this truly been an impossible coincidence? The more I considered those possibilities, the less I liked any of them. Eventually, I decided there was no point trying to solve a mystery that had no obvious answer. I blocked the account, changed my Instagram profile to private, removed unnecessary personal information. For the first time in years, I even reviewed my follower list to make sure I recognized everyone. Those simple changes gave me a small sense of control, enough at least that I slowly stopped thinking about him again. Nearly a month passed. Nothing happened. Life returned to normal. Then, one evening, I made a decision I almost never make. I opened my TikTok message requests. Normally, I ignore them completely. Most consist of obvious scam accounts, fake promotions, spam advertisements, or viewers saying hello after watching one of my live streams. I scrolled through dozens of them without much interest. Then one account caught my attention. Unlike the others, this profile had over 2,000 followers. It looked genuine. The message had been sitting there for nearly a week. It contained only one word. I. Nothing threatening. Nothing unusual. Thinking it might be another content creator or someone I'd spoken to before, I replied. Within moments they answered, "Do you remember me?" I searched my memory. Nothing. I apologized and admitted I couldn't place them. They replied with what they claimed was their real name. It meant absolutely nothing to me. Still trying to be polite, I asked, "Did we know each other somewhere else?" Their answer arrived almost immediately. "We talked on Instagram." I frowned. "I still don't remember." Then came another message. "You blocked me." A strange feeling settled into my chest. The next sentence appeared. "Because I kept messaging you." Time seemed to stop. My pulse quickened. Surely. No, it couldn't be. Hands trembling slightly, I typed one final question. "Was your old Instagram username?" I wrote the exact username I remembered from 2 years earlier. Several agonizing seconds passed. Then, the typing indicator appeared. One word arrived. Yes, I actually swore out loud. Not dramatically. Not intentionally. The word escaped before I even realized I'd spoken. One of my housemates, hearing me from downstairs, immediately came up to check whether everything was all right. I handed them my phone. As they read through the conversation, the expression on their face slowly changed. Confusion. Concern. Then, disbelief. Just like Connor had before, they gave exactly the same advice. Block him. Before doing so, I couldn't resist sending one final message. Not because I expected it to change anything, but because I wanted there to be absolutely no ambiguity. I wrote, "Leave me alone. Stop contacting me. Do not message me again." I waited only long enough to make sure it had been delivered. Then I blocked the account. Again. By that point, an unsettling realization had become impossible to ignore. This wasn't someone who had randomly stumbled across my profile twice. This was someone who had somehow managed to find me again after years of silence, on 2 entirely different social media platforms, without any obvious connection, without mutual friends, without any explanation that made sense. That was the moment I stopped viewing the situation as an annoying online interaction. It became something far more disturbing, because once is an accident, twice is coincidence. But when the same stranger keeps finding you years later across different corners of the internet despite every attempt to disappear, you inevitably begin asking yourself a question that no one ever wants to ask. Exactly how long has someone been watching, without you ever realizing it? What unsettled me more than anything wasn't simply the fact that he had found me again. It was where he had found me. My TikTok account didn't even use my real name. There was no obvious connection between my Instagram profile and my TikTok account. Different usernames, different profile photos, different content. I had gone out of my way to keep my online presence separate, partly out of habit and partly because I valued my privacy. Yet somehow, he had crossed that invisible line. That was the first moment I seriously allowed myself to think a word I had avoided for years. Stalker. Until then, I'd kept convincing myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe he was just another persistent stranger. Maybe he had stumbled across my profiles by coincidence. Maybe I was giving the situation more importance than it deserved. But coincidences have limits. Finding me once could have been luck. Finding me twice years apart on entirely different platforms that weren't connected in any obvious way That no longer felt like chance. It felt deliberate. For the first time, I considered the possibility that I wasn't dealing with someone who simply refused to take a hint. I might have been dealing with someone who had quietly been searching for me all along. That realization sat in the back of my mind for days. It changed the way I used social media. I checked my follower lists more often. I stopped accepting random requests. I became strangely aware of how much information people unknowingly reveal online. The places they visit, the cafes they like, the routes they walk, the landmarks visible behind them in photographs. I'd never thought much about those details before. Now every post felt like a breadcrumb leading someone closer to my front door. I made a decision. If he ever contacted me again, or if anything happened that suggested he knew where I was, I wouldn't dismiss it. I would go straight to the police. No more giving him the benefit of the doubt. No more assuming it was harmless. A few days later, I met several friends in the city for dinner. For a few hours, I almost forgot everything. We laughed, talked about work, made plans for the weekend. It felt wonderfully ordinary. When we finally said goodbye, I caught the late train home. The ride itself was uneventful. I spent most of it answering messages and absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone. By the time I stepped onto the platform, it was already dark. The station emptied quickly. Within minutes, only a handful of commuters remained, each disappearing in different directions. My house wasn't far away. Normally, the walk took less than 10 minutes. I'd made it hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. That night felt different from the very beginning. The streets seemed unusually quiet. No passing cars. No distant conversations. Even the wind had died away. The silence felt almost unnatural, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps echoing against the pavement. As I walked, I continued texting my friends. Then I heard another set of footsteps. Soft, steady. Somewhere behind me. At first, I barely noticed them. When you're walking alone at night, it's easy to mistake echoes for movement. Still, something about the rhythm bothered me. I stopped. Immediately, the footsteps stopped too. The silence returned so suddenly it almost hurt my ears. I slowly turned around. The street stretched empty beneath pools of yellow streetlight. Nothing. No pedestrians. No cyclists. No parked cars with engines running. Just an empty sidewalk disappearing into darkness. I let out a quiet breath. You're imagining things. That's all. I laughed nervously at myself and continued walking. Perhaps 30 seconds later, I heard them again. This time they sounded closer. More distinct. Step, step, step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped once more. But this time, the footsteps didn't. They continued. One more step, then another. Only after several seconds did they finally come to a halt. They weren't mine. There was no denying it anymore. A cold knot tightened deep in my stomach. Slowly, very slowly, I turned around. Someone stood on the sidewalk behind me, perhaps 20 feet away, completely motionless, watching me. A single street lamp illuminated his face with harsh yellow light. The moment I saw him, every ounce of blood seemed to drain from my body. I knew that face. I knew it instantly. The pale skin, the messy brown hair, the broad shoulders, the piercing blue eyes that somehow looked just as empty in real life as they had in every photograph. It was him, the man from Instagram, the man from TikTok, the stranger who had somehow refused to disappear from my life for years. For several endless seconds, neither of us moved. The street became impossibly still. No passing cars, no barking dogs, no voices from nearby houses, just two people standing beneath the glow of a lonely streetlight. Then he smiled. Not widely, not warmly, just enough to suggest recognition, almost as if we'd accidentally bumped into one another after years apart. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, he spoke my name, not loudly, not aggressively, simply, as though greeting an old friend. Every instinct inside me screamed the same command. Run. I didn't hesitate. I turned and sprinted. I didn't look back. Not once. There are moments when fear becomes so overwhelming that rational thought disappears completely. This was one of those moments. I wasn't thinking about dignity. I wasn't thinking about whether I looked ridiculous. I wasn't even thinking about where I was running. Only one thought existed. Get away. Fast, thankfully, my house sat inside a large residential complex. From the main entrance, individual units couldn't be seen directly. You had to follow a winding path before reaching the front doors. That small design feature may have been the only reason I made it inside without knowing whether he was still behind me. I reached the entrance and rounded the final corner at full speed. My front door came into view. Relief lasted less than a second. It was locked. Of course it was locked. My hands shook so violently I could barely unzip my backpack. Keys. Where were my keys? Every second felt impossibly long. I kept glancing toward the corner I just turned, expecting him, waiting to see him calmly walk around it. I imagined those same pale eyes meeting mine again. Nothing appeared. Yet somehow, that almost frightened me more. Finally, my fingers found the keys. I fumbled twice before getting the correct one into the lock. The mechanism clicked. I practically threw myself inside. The door slammed shut behind me with enough force to shake the walls. Connor and another housemate were sitting in the living room. The moment they looked at me, both of them stood up. Apparently, every trace of color had disappeared from my face. For several seconds, I couldn't even speak. My lungs burned. My heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. Eventually, I managed to tell them everything. Every message, every fake account, every strange coincidence, every footstep, every second of that encounter beneath the streetlight. Before I'd even finished speaking, my friends ran back outside. They hoped the man hadn't gotten far. Connor stayed with me while the others searched the surrounding streets. Nothing. He had vanished. Not hidden. Not running. Simply gone. Within minutes, the police arrived. They searched far more thoroughly than my friends had. Nearby streets, parking areas, walking paths, bus stops. Nothing. No witnesses. No sign that anyone matching his description had been nearby. The officers advised me to keep every door and window locked, avoid walking home alone whenever possible, and contact emergency services immediately if I saw him again. They also recommended beginning the legal process of obtaining a restraining order. That conversation happened only a couple of weeks ago. Since then, I've gathered every screenshot I ever saved, every threatening message, every fake account, every photograph, every interaction. I now know his real name. I can accurately describe his appearance. If necessary, I can provide police with enough information to identify him. But despite all of that, one question refuses to leave my mind. How? How did he keep finding me? Years passed between encounters. I changed usernames, changed homes, changed social media habits, yet somehow, he always seemed to know where to look. Sometimes I wonder whether he'd been searching continuously all those years. Other times I wonder whether he'd somehow been watching from much closer than I ever realized. The most disturbing thought, however, isn't how he found me. It's what might have happened if I hadn't turned around that night. If I'd never heard those footsteps, if I'd continued walking completely unaware that someone was only a few yards behind me, would he have followed me all the way home? Would he have simply watched from a distance before disappearing into the darkness? Or had he already decided that this would be the night he finally introduced himself face to face? Those are questions I know I'll probably never be able to answer. Perhaps that's for the best. Some answers aren't comforting. They're simply terrifying. Since that night, I've developed habits I never had before. Whenever I walk alone after sunset, I check every reflection in shop windows. I glance over my shoulder far more often than I probably need to. I avoid wearing headphones. I pay attention to footsteps, to parked cars, to people who seem to appear more than once. I've learned that real fear rarely announces itself with screams or dramatic music. Sometimes it begins with something as ordinary as a message request from a stranger, then another, until one day, you turn around on an empty street and realize the face you've only ever seen on a screen has been quietly following you through the darkness. I sincerely hope I never see him again. And if fate is kind, there will never be another chapter to this story.